Some of the most dangerous moments in your life don't look dramatic. They don't arrive with noise. They don't break anything immediately. They don't announce themselves as a crisis. They look ordinary. They look like days that keep moving forward without resistance. They look like doing what you've always done and realizing nothing feels different anymore. They look like waiting. They look like patience that doesn't feel noble, just prolonged. They look like obedience that never turns into relief. And the question that begins forming doesn't come with panic. It doesn't sound rebellious. It doesn't feel sinful. It's quiet enough that you almost don't notice it at first. It slips into your thinking when you're alone. It surfaces when you stop distracting yourself. It shows up in the space between one effort and the next. Did I miss something? Not, is God real? Not, does faith matter? Just, did I miss something? There's a version of you that still believes. You haven't walked away. You haven't given up. You haven't stopped showing up. You still pray. You still try. You still reach. And there's another version of you that's tired of pretending belief feels strong. Not tired in a dramatic way, not tired in a hopeless way, just worn down from holding faith together without response. You're not angry. You're not resentful. You're not trying to escape. You're just exhausted from carrying trust without confirmation. And nobody warned you about this part. They warned you about loss. They warned you about suffering. They warned you about pain that forces you to cling harder. But they didn't warn you about seasons where nothing hurts enough to justify leaving and nothing improves enough to justify staying hopeful. They didn't warn you about quiet endurance. They didn't warn you about emotional flatlines. They didn't warn you about how draining it is to keep believing when belief doesn't feel rewarded. What if the hardest seasons aren't the ones where everything falls apart, but the ones where nothing does? What if nothing breaking is exactly what keeps you stuck? What if silence isn't absence, but exposure? You still say the right words. You still move through life with the appearance of stability. You still function. But something inside you feels disconnected, not shattered, not collapsed, just distant. And distance is harder to explain than pain. Pain gives you language. Pain gives you permission to ask for help. Distance just exists. It lingers. It hums quietly beneath your routines. And the unsettling part isn't the distance itself. It's realizing you don't know how long you can keep doing this without clarity. Nobody tells you this. But faith without reassurance changes you. Not suddenly, gradually. It reshapes how you carry yourself. It alters how you interpret silence. It shifts how you relate to hope. It either deepens you or hardens you. And you don't get to choose which one until you're already inside it. So what happens if this season lasts longer than you expected? What happens if nothing resolves soon? What happens if the quiet doesn't break on your timeline? You don't talk about this because you don't want to sound weak. You don't want to sound entitled. You don't want to sound like you're questioning something you're supposed to trust. So you keep smiling. You keep functioning. You keep moving forward with a heaviness no one sees. And the weight you carry doesn't leave marks on your body. It leaves hesitation in your thoughts. It leaves pauses in your decisions. It leaves moments where you stop mid-sentence and don't know why. Some prayers don't get answered quickly. Some don't get answered clearly. And some force you to sit with questions you thought belief would eliminate. What if faith was never designed to remove tension? What if tension was the environment where faith shows you what it's actually attached to? You've heard people say, just trust God. But trust is easy when things make sense. Trust is easy when progress is visible. Trust is different when nothing explains itself. And maybe the real struggle isn't trust at all. Maybe it's remaining present without control. There are seasons where clarity feels withheld, where peace feels postponed, where answers feel close but unreachable. And you start wondering if the silence is intentional or accidental, if it's purposeful or random. And not knowing is what unsettles you most. You're still faithful, still committed, still present, but quieter, more careful, less certain about how long you can sustain this without direction. And maybe that version of you isn't weaker. Maybe it's just unprotected. Maybe it's the version of you that hasn't learned yet how to exist without emotional armor. Because silence doesn't just test belief. It tests endurance. It tests attachment. It tests how much of your peace was built on outcomes instead of presence. It tests whether you can sit without being reassured. And that's uncomfortable. Because it's easier to fight storms than coexist with stillness that refuses to explain itself. It's easier to survive chaos than remain faithful in ambiguity. You don't lose faith here. You don't gain certainty either. You just become aware of how much of your strength was tied to momentum. How much of your hope depended on movement. How much of your trust was supported by clarity. And when those supports disappear, nothing collapses. But nothing feels secure either. And that tension is exhausting. Because it doesn't end dramatically. It doesn't peak. It just continues, day after day. And you start negotiating with yourself. You tell yourself you shouldn't feel this way. You tell yourself others have it worse. You tell yourself to be grateful. But none of that removes the pressure. It just teaches you how to hide it better. And hiding endurance costs more than suffering openly. Because silence requires constant management. You manage your tone. You manage your reactions. You manage your expectations. You manage your disappointment so it doesn't turn into something you don't know how to carry. And sometimes you wonder if this version of you is being shaped or slowly emptied. You wonder if staying is obedience or avoidance. You wonder if waiting is wisdom or fear disguised as patience. But you don't say that out loud. Because questions like that don't sound safe. They don't sound faithful. They don't sound acceptable. So they stay internal. They circulate quietly inside you. And silence becomes crowded. You replay conversations you never had. You rehearse prayers you never finish. You imagine clarity that never arrives. And the unsettling truth is, nothing is technically wrong. Life keeps moving. Responsibilities remain. You're functioning. Which makes it harder to explain why you feel unsettled. Because unrest without collapse feels unjustified. And yet, it's real, and it doesn't leave. You start noticing how often you distract yourself, how often you fill space with noise, how rarely you sit still without reaching for something. Because stillness brings awareness, and awareness brings questions you don't have answers for. And answers are what you've been trained to expect. But this season doesn't give them. It just gives you time. Time to notice what you lean on when reassurance disappears. Time to see how much of your confidence came from certainty. Time to observe what happens when belief isn't rewarded with immediate peace. And that observation is unsettling. Because it strips away the parts of faith that depended on outcomes. It leaves you with presence. And presence is harder than belief. Because belief can be conceptual. Presence requires endurance. And endurance without clarity is one of the most vulnerable places a person can inhabit. You start to feel exposed. Not to others, to yourself. Your motivations, your expectations, your hidden conditions. And once you see them, you can't unsee them. You notice how often you expected silence to end. How often you assumed this was temporary. How often you told yourself relief was just around the corner. And now you're here. Still waiting, still present, still unsure how long this lasts. And that uncertainty doesn't scream. It just presses. It presses when you're alone. It presses when you're quiet. It presses when you stop pretending everything is fine. And you don't know if that pressure is shaping you, or testing you, or simply revealing you. You just know it's not leaving yet. And that awareness changes how you move forward. Not dramatically, subtly. You become more cautious with hope, more selective with expectation, more aware of what silence can do to a person over time. And maybe this isn't the part where everything resolves. Maybe this is the part where you discover what remains when reassurance disappears. What stays when comfort is removed. What surfaces when belief is no longer reinforced by results. And whatever that is, it matters. Even if it doesn't feel good, even if it doesn't feel clear, even if it doesn't feel finished. Because unfinished spaces have a way of revealing what certainty never could. And that's the part you're sitting in now. Whether you named it or not, whether you're ready or not, whether you talk about it or keep carrying it quietly, it's here. And it's not rushing, and neither are you. Not yet. And the strange thing is, nothing tells you when you've crossed into this place. There's no announcement. No moment where you can point and say, this is where it changed. It just happens slowly. You realize one day that you're not asking certain questions anymore, because you already know they won't be answered soon. You notice how your prayers shorten, not because you care less, but because you're conserving energy. You stop explaining things to people because explanation requires hope that understanding will follow. And you're not sure you have enough of that left to spend casually. You still believe, but belief feels quieter now, less dramatic, less expressive. It's not something you perform anymore, it's something you carry. And carrying something heavy without setting it down changes your posture over time. You don't collapse, you adjust. You learn how to distribute the weight so it hurts less in one place, even if it never really leaves. And no one sees that adjustment. They just see that you're still standing, which makes them assume you're fine. And maybe that's the most isolating part. Not the silence itself, but the fact that silence looks like strength from the outside. People admire endurance without realizing what it costs. They praise consistency without asking what it's draining. They assume faith is thriving because it hasn't disappeared. But survival and nourishment are not the same thing. And you can survive a very long time without being fed. You start wondering how many people around you are doing the same thing. How many are quietly holding together something that feels thinner than it used to? How many are smiling while negotiating internally with expectations they're afraid to release? Because releasing them would mean admitting they mattered more than they wanted to admit. And that's dangerous. Not because expectation is wrong, but because once you see how attached you were to outcomes, you can't pretend you weren't. And pretending was easier. It allowed you to move forward without questioning the structure underneath. Now the structure is visible. And visibility changes everything. You notice patterns. You notice how silence tends to surface right after certainty. How it follows seasons where things felt aligned. Almost as if clarity creates the conditions for quiet to test what it built. And that thought is unsettling. Because it suggests this isn't random. It suggests this might be intentional. But intentional silence is harder to sit with than accidental absence. Because accidental absence can be blamed. Intentional silence has to be endured. And endurance without explanation is one of the most difficult positions to remain in. You start checking yourself, not for sin, not for failure, but for motivation. You ask questions like, if nothing changes, do I still stay? If nothing improves, do I still show up? If clarity never comes, do I still believe this matters? And those questions don't come from rebellion. They come from honesty. But honesty feels risky when it isn't rewarded with reassurance. So you keep those questions internal. You let them circulate quietly. You let them press against your identity without naming them. And unnamed pressure has a way of shaping you anyway. You become more reserved, more internal, less expressive, with certainty. You stop declaring things confidently, because confidence feels fragile now. You've seen how quickly certainty can be removed. And once you know that, you handle belief more carefully. Not because it's weaker, but because it's exposed. You don't want to pretend anymore. Pretending requires energy you don't have. So you stay honest. And honesty without resolution feels unfinished. It feels like standing mid-sentence without knowing how it ends. And maybe that's what makes this season so uncomfortable. Not that it hurts, but that it doesn't conclude. It just continues. You wake up and the questions are still there. You go to sleep and they don't resolve. You make progress in life and they remain. You experience good moments and they quietly watch from the background. They don't interrupt joy. They coexist with it. And coexistence is harder to escape than pain, because pain demands attention. Coexistence just lingers, and lingering tension reshapes identity. You start identifying less with answers and more with endurance. Less with certainty and more with presence. Less with confidence and more with persistence. And persistence without applause feels invisible. You don't know if anyone would notice if you stopped. That thought doesn't tempt you to quit. It just makes you aware of how much of your effort exists without recognition. And recognition isn't the goal. But absence of recognition reveals what you were hoping for without admitting it. And that realization is uncomfortable, because it forces you to confront why reassurance mattered so much, why confirmation felt necessary, why silence feels heavier than pain ever did. And you don't rush to answer those questions, because answers would simplify them, and simplification would remove the tension. And the tension is doing something. Even if you don't know what yet, you just know it's shaping how you relate to belief, how you relate to trust, how you relate to yourself when nothing external reinforces what you're carrying internally. And maybe this isn't about arriving anywhere. Maybe it's about noticing. Noticing what remains when expectations dissolve. Noticing what stays when certainty withdraws. Noticing who you become when belief stops being loud. Because loud faith is visible, quiet faith is exposed. And exposure is uncomfortable. It removes protection, it removes performance. It removes the safety of appearing resolved. You're not resolved, you're present. And presence without clarity is one of the most demanding states a person can inhabit, because it requires you to stay without knowing why staying matters yet. And that's where you are, still here, still carrying, still uncertain how long this lasts, still aware that something is happening, even if you can't name it. And whatever that something is, it isn't finished. Not yet.